So Khomeinism was published in 1993, and then you published the book that we are about to begin discussing, Tortured Confession, in 1999. So this is a very important book, politically important, but also analytically is also very important. You very boldly argue that both what you refer to as mass executions, which is really a reference to executions of thousands of people in 1988, executions of prisoners, but also confessions. You reject or dismiss the argument that the regime they engaged in these horrible atrocities because it was weak or because it wanted to teach oppositions or critics a lesson, but that Khomeini in particular issued the fatwa or the order, this committee to begin the process that led to mass executions because of internal divisions within government. And of course, I should have mentioned that you also do not think that Khomeini and others were motivated by religious beliefs in doing what they did. Please share with us what was in your mind or what was the plan when you research and publish these books, but then there are lots of questions that we can discuss.
Well, the primary reason for the book was basically an argument against Foucault. Because according to Foucault in his book on discipline, he argues that in traditional societies, physical punishment, torture, was the prevalent way of dealing with opposition. And that in modern world, physical punishment and torture drops out. It becomes much more incarceration, social pressure, or psychological pressure. And I said, if you apply this transformation to Iran, it doesn't work, because you find it's true, yes, in traditional society, let's say early Qajar period, punishment was usually physical, public, so on. Torture was considered quite normal. Then you, in the 20th century, in fact, notion comes in that transgressors of the law should be imprisoned rather than punished publicly. And torture actually drops out from political scene. So during actually Reza Shah's period, dissidents were often killed, but you don't have cases of actually torture, physical torture, in order to get some sort of confession. You even have in prison memoirs people saying, telling the warden, I'll sign anything you want. I just want to get out. And the warden says, we don't care what you think. You're going to be here until you serve your sentence. But towards the end of Second Pahlavi, you get, for the first time, return of torture for a very different reason, not just for police information, to get people to go into the public arena, television, in so-called goftegus, where they confess to having ideologically misunderstood or been misled, and basically submitting to the regime for all the good things it's doing, i.e. supporting the regime. And then, of course, in the Islamic Republic, this becomes on much more full scale, that there is torture for information, but most of the torture is done really to get public confessions. So the question becomes, what is the purpose of this? And for me, the purpose is, if you have a regime that is ideological and is interested in public's hearts and minds of the viewers, then the public spectacle is the important issue. And this is not a question of a dichotomy between modern or traditional. Traditional medieval countries, societies, states also were interested in public confessions. So the Islamic Republic seems like reverting to medieval methods, but in fact, it's actually a modern method that even the Stalinists used very much and Maoists used a lot, is to get especially former dissidents to go to the public and say they made a mistake and the regime is correct in what it's doing. So it's a basic form of public submission to the state, to the authorities. But to get that, the method is, well, if you can persuade someone that they're wrong, and that's fine. Probably the Shah's regime did that with Nikah, a famous opponent who came to the press and talked about how glorious the White Revolution was. But most of the others who came were done under duress, often physical torture. So the Islamic Republic after the revolution really resorted to this on a massive scale. So it was actually surprising that so many people who watched those were in fact impressed and persuaded by it, because they could say, well, these people had opposed the regime for their whole career. They've spent their years in prison. Now they're coming and saying, they're submitting to the state. But often, of course, the viewer didn't know the type of stage preparations that went into these shows. They were often very brutal, very consistent physical torture, not only on the prisoner, but on relatives, close members of children or wives of the prisoners, to get the prisoner to go and in front of the cameras and give the e'tirafat, basically the confession, which is really a submission to the authorities. So that became actually a major propaganda system of the regime to legitimize itself. And I think it worked at first. I think the more it's used and the more people get aware of what goes on into the preparations, it becomes less useful. But the heights were, of course, in 1980, 83, 84. And then they were also used after 2009 contested elections, where, of course, it was often reform Islamicists who went in front of the cameras and made confessions, were clearly coerced confessions. The bottom line is the regimes that are ideological and want to win over people's minds and hearts resort to this type of coercion.
So, of course, when you said this was a critique of Foucault, there is a book by Dariush Rejali on the same topic, although mainly on torture, and you are critiquing that study, right? Was that book published before yours? I cannot remember now.
No, it was published afterwards, but you're right. My book could be seen as a critique because he really doesn't have an explanation, sort of just psychological, that any regime that is brutal will use torture. Mine argument is that there was a so-called rational reason why ideological regimes will resort to this. It doesn't justify it, but there is it's not just a question of sadism of the regime or the wardens. There is a systematic thinking behind it.
However, as far as I can remember, I read the other book, Dariush Rejali's book, probably 25 years ago. I may misremember it, but a substantial part of the book is discourse analysis and trying to give a sort of interpretation of Iranian political history according to Foucault. But he makes one argument that I feel is compatible with your book, and that is that the kind of punishment that modern states or in modern times governments engage in are not less brutal. And in fact, in what Foucault called disciplinary societies, the kind of brutality can be even worse. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there is that, I think, underlying presumption in Foucault and also in Rajali's book that somehow psychological or incarceration can be worse than physical.
That's true.
Yeah. The thing is, I mean, if you just, gut reaction, how would you think if, would you rather someone who has broken the law be put away in a cell, let's say, for a period of time? Is that worse or better than putting someone in a public forum and whipping them? I think the sensitivity of, I wouldn't call it modernity, but there is a change, I think, after the Enlightenment, that actually physical brutality is not legitimate punishment because it's a form of sadism, while putting someone in prison is not basically nice, but it's a better way of punishment than whipping someone or chopping off their hands or torturing them until they confess. And you can actually say, early Iranian politicians who were put in Ghasr, would say, oh, this is far worse than what we had before, because they didn't like to be incarcerated. But I wonder if they would have preferred to have had their eyes torn out or their hands chopped off. I mean, I think that Foucault is basically using rhetoric to challenge the notion that societies have become more sensitive or more civilized on this sphere. And you can, I mean, in Iran, right after the revolution, you get senior clerics saying that, we don't need prisons. The Islamic way of punishment was much better and much more actually humane than putting people in prison. So we return to traditional forms of punishment. But the reality is, is the public, the general viewers willing to see a lot of public punishment, of public hangings, the executions, or of having people's hands chopped off? Would they prefer to see that rather than have some people put in prison? So the Islamic Republic has, in fact, somehow had to moderate and adjust its Islamic concepts to the modern reality that opponents or lawbreakers, proper way of punishment is incarceration rather than physical punishment.
Of course, and this also, your earlier point on basically ask someone who has been tortured if he or she prefers to just be in prison or be tortured, indicates how sloppy discourse analysis is. And really, maybe the answer to both conspiracy theory and discourse analysis is to do a good history job, gather the evidence, talk to people, and instead of, you say psychological, but this is not even psychological. Anyone who has, there are lots of documents, you document them in your book, but since then there are awful lots of documents by prisoners, those who have been tortured, on how horrible it is to be a subject of physical torture. I just wanted to mention this book because, as you know, there is a debate going on, has been going on around this whole notion of why Islamic Republic engaged in both these public confessions, but also torture. But can now move to the 88 case of really, I cannot remember in history of Iran any government engaging in execution of several thousands of political prisoners. Am I right? Do we know any other cases in Iranian history that a government engaged in such a brutal act?
But I mean, it's not necessarily in prison, but I mean, in South America, Central America, you have mass killings of what the regime considers threatening populations. So mass killings are not that.
No, but is the fact that people are already captured and in prison, in other words?
I think there, of course, the question is, I think, much more resonating, and it's often not discussed, is on what grounds were people executed? Executing people who are involved in armed struggle, even if they no longer have arms, but have advocated armed struggle and are likely to do so. That's not that uncommon. But I think what was very striking and often is actually not really discussed, even in the West, is the grounds on which these people were executed in 1988. So former Mujahideen were executed not because they were Mujahideen, because they had ceased being Mujahideen. But the question was, how far were they willing to go in support of the regime before they could be basically not executed. So they were being pushed to the brink. For instance, if you called the Mujahideen, then that was seen as still you're a Mujahideen. If you called them Munafiqeen, that's okay. But the next question is, are you willing to go and fight against the Mujahideen? Are you willing to go and execute fellow former Mujahideen? So they were pushing them to the brink, basically trying to get as many executed as possible. So that's one category. You can say it's outrageous. But even more outrageous is a second category, which is never discussed, which was people were asked theological questions and had absolutely nothing to do with politics. They weren't asked, do you support the Islamic Republic? Are you willing to go and fight for the Islamic Republic? Do you have questions about it? They were not asked any of these questions. Or do you support this or other foreign country? I.e., do you have foreign links? None of these questions were asked. They were asked questions, theological questions, such as, do you believe in the afterlife? Do you believe in the resurrection of the body? Do you believe in the Quran as being the word of God? These are purely theological questions. And if you gave the wrong answer, you were then sent off to the line to be executed. The only way you could avoid that line is if you were not brought up as a Muslim. And if you were not brought up as a Muslim, then you couldn't be labeled as an apostate. But if you had a Muslim upbringing and rejected those notions, then the label was apostasy. And the punishment was apostasy, was execution. Now, this is basically the novelty. It sounds medieval, but this had never really been used in Iran for executing people. But a large number of people were executed for giving the wrong answers on these theological issues. And this, I think, shows basically the so-called real fundamentalists in the Khomeini movement had really become predominant. The populist movement had really basically been submerged by real diehard thinkers, like the Fedayeen Islam form of thinking, that if you are not absolutely agree with the medieval principles of Islam, then you're an apostate, and as apostate, you have to be executed. So that is something that is often not actually even mentioned in foreign reporting on these prison killings. And it's interesting, that although the regime used this internally, they never admitted it. Because again, for them to admit this publicly, it would show basically how retrogressive and how uncivilized the regime is, that it's executing people because they don't believe in the afterlife.
But of course, you are not suggesting that the regime was merely motivated by theological questions. For instance, I know I have seen documentations that they asked such a question from members of the Tudor party, knowing that they don't believe in Quran and more or less knowing what their response would be. But the decision had already made to execute them from the religious perspective. They try to justify it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that their framework of thinking is they clearly, for political reasons, want to execute these people, but they're using a religious argument to do it, which is apostasy, which is for the clerics might be acceptable, but for the general public, for internationally, of course, it would be a big embarrassment. But I find it interesting that with Montazeri in his memoirs, he is very critical of the execution of the Mujahideen. He really doesn't try to challenge the regime on the question of apostasy. So to me, that sign that within the clerical hierarchy, they still seem to believe that apostasy should be punished by execution. At least no one is willing to come out and challenge that principle. No, so Montazeri, however critical he was of the Islamic Republic, he was not willing to challenge the Khomeini on that issue.
That is interesting. I don't remember you discussing that in the book, but let me ask a follow-up question. Did you have, when you were working on this book, any hard evidence on what was in Khomeini's letter to this committee?
Yes, I mean, there are two fatwas. One is about the Mujahideen, one is about apostasy, two separate fatwas. And you often, the two are merged as one, but in fact, they're separate.
And your interpretation of, say, I sort of understand the second one. What was Khomeini's argument or rationale for executing Mujahideen or these prisoners?
Well, it was by the conclusion I came to was by elimination of other arguments they had. One was that there was such a threat to the Islamic Republic. Well, in 1988, there was no threat. You know, the Mujahideen had done the last gasp and it failed. The left was in no way a threat to the regime. The victory over, well, that peace had come. The general notion was going to be a general amnesty. The war is no longer there. The country is no longer in danger. Why have political prisoners? So there was a different mood from the threat. Regimes, when they're threatened, can act brutally, but here there was no threat. The other notion was that the prisoners were so full, you had to empty them out. Again, that doesn't hold water because, in fact, there was still room in prisons. The earlier period, the prisons had been fuller than at that time. And anyway, if the prisons are full, you can release people after they've served their sentence. You don't have to kill them. So by elimination of these other interpretations, I concluded, or I mean, try to give another reason, was that Khomeini wanted to do something really outrageous to solidify his support, that only people who were fully committed would basically remain within the Islamic Republic. So people who were half-hearted, later be called liberal Muslims, or even someone like Montazeri, who was considered the closest disciple of Khomeini and so on, they would either have to accept this outrageous act or distance themselves, i.e., it would be a self-purge of the regime. Only the fully committed would remain, and the half-hearted, the doubting would leave. And I think it was basically a Khomeini's version of self-purge of the regime. It definitely pushed basically Montazeri out, although, as I said, he did take the issue of the apostasy, but the execution of former mujahideen who were no longer a threat being executed. So, and others, in fact, Rafsanjani, Khamenei, by not saying anything, by even denying that this has occurred, was in a way accepting the regimes. And of course, it also came the time of the Rushdie affair, because again, Rushdie was sentenced to death on grounds of apostasy. And this was a way of also cutting Iran off from the West by having that fatwa. And this, in the Iranian context, the same sort of fatwa basically purified into the diehards of the regime.
Thank you. Well, the prison issue in '88 is very complex and complicated and painful to talk about. I just want to say something about Montazeri on apostasy. And one of the ways he rescued women from execution was to declare that, according to Islamic law, women are not. I apologize for the language, but the argument was that women are not rational enough to apostatize. Therefore, women were not executed for apostasy. This is a major turning point in keeping women from being executed. They were beaten up, correct, but this fatwa about Montazeri was a way that many women prisoners now know that this was what saved them. Anyway, I won't talk about the prison issue and the executions in '88 and the role of whether Khomeini said destroy the enemies of Islam or his son wrote that, or the role of this band of killers that later on took over the machinery of the Islamic Republic. I won't talk about that, but I will talk about the Foucauldian critique of Professor Abrahamian. I think it's a very important response to discourse analysis of Foucault. So, with the question of genealogy, in fact, he highlights paths that are not taken, and there is no historical determinism in one direction, that we all have to become modern, and there is no reason that expands itself through history. And I remember in The Birth of the Prison, he very clearly says that the reform of prisons was not because these reformers were better human beings. He's very clear about that, I think. And I think the important contribution of your book on tortured confessions is to show that in the case of Iran, for example, the path was very different from that taken in Europe, that tortured confessions continued. Torture continued. It certainly continued for criminals. It never stopped for criminals. Anybody who knows anything about Agahi in Iran, the police, the beating of the suspects was bread and butter of Reza Shah, continued to be bread and butter of every policeman, kicking and hitting and all kinds of torture that are detailed in works. But then under the Pahlavi II, during the 60s and 70s, after the change in the leadership of the Savak, torture became a very important instrument in the hand of the state to break the prisoners. And then the Islamic Republic appropriated it. What I'm saying only is that as important, as excellent, as very significant as the critique of Foucault is in the case of Iran, if I understand correctly, the notion of genealogy allows for this critique, because Foucault only talks about what happened in France and America and England at the turn of the 19th century and the birth of the prison. That need not apply to South America or to Egypt or to Iran or to what colonialism did in Algeria well into the middle of the 19th century, late 19th century. And he is talking about I thought, in prison reform in Europe and the United States by extension. So very important corrective that this is not what happened in Iran, but I think it's still as important the critique as it is not a rebuttal of the view that this is what happened in Europe. the birth of prison in Europe took place in this way. The birth of the prison or the transformation of confinement in space took place in Iran in a very different manner. Would you think this is a valid way of thinking about the critique?
Well, it's hard to grapple with Foucault because he often actually, when he was asked the historical question, he would answer that I'm not a historian. So, but what comes through in his works is this sort of juxtaposing contrast between what you could call traditional modern, that there is a traditional way of doing things, there's a modern way of doing it, and the breaking point is the Enlightenment. Again, underlying much of his writing is a critique of the Enlightenment. Somehow for him, things go worse after the Enlightenment. There's sort of nostalgia for something pre-Enlightenment. To the point that, in fact, in his writings on Iran, he talks about how the Enlightenment led to the Nazism. Now, I don't know how he argues, historically argues, because the Nazis, in fact, thought that the world started going to the dogs because of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. They certainly didn't see themselves as in the line of the Enlightenment. So I think Foucault, in many ways, was somewhat taken by his critique of what he would see the modern world, and trying to blame things that really are not blamable to the Enlightenment of things he didn't like, including the Nazi regime. So one has to, I think, take Foucault on large-scale things. What is he juxtaposing? What is he contrasting? And there is the contrast that in traditional societies it was physical punishment. In modern societies, it's a worse situation. It's incarceration. So there is that, I think, simple dichotomy between his thinking.
I also agree, Hossein Jan. Your argument is very, very good argument. The only problem is that Foucault doesn't argue that. Foucault's claim on his genealogical methodology is exactly what Ervand said, is a critique of modernity, modern world, not just, he is not producing in Birth of Clinic a history of Europe, but his approach is critique of the modern. And the evidence is, as Ervand said, if you read carefully his writings on Iran, you see this, that he does not at all make this distinction that, say, modern Iran is different from modern Europe. The distinction he makes when it comes to what he called the emergence of spirituality, which he very carefully defines as not modern, and then he praises. This is the dilemma with Foucault, but thank you for that comment.
Thank you so much. I just think that it's important that Foucault repeatedly refuses to identify himself as a historian, and he condemns history. As
Heidegger also did.
Right, of course.
And Nietzsche did, and this is the main problem.
Okay, and talking about the Iranian case, remember Ali Shariati said that he hated 2 or 3 T's. He said as set mutanafira, Tagizadeh, Tariq, and the third one I don't remember. So which he very much took from this radicalism of the 60s in France. This rejection of history, which is populist and also fascist, and reconcilable with fascism, that only the present matters and the future matters, and not the past. But however, in my comment, I didn't mean to bring all of this in, but the approach that genealogy allows for paths that were not taken, and even if Foucault made a mistake, especially in what he said about the Iranian Revolution, which one finds very naive, but the apparatus that he set up, I think, allows us for thinking in terms of paths that were not taken. Just for my own thinking and clarification. But thank you very much.
Just going back to the question of torture, you mentioned that under Reza Shah, criminals were often beaten up in prison. It's actually it's a class distinction. What you find under Reza Shah is, criminals, common criminals are usually considered poor working class. That's fair game. Then the police can beat the shit out of them. But it's interesting because of this, I think, a modern sensitivity from the Mashrutiyat on, even into after the coup, 53, there is the notion that political prisoners are not to be tortured. The exception is when there is vital intelligence information to be obtained. Okay, so under Reza Shah, the communists who are imprisoned, usually there's no talk about being tortured. In fact, they usually talk about they sit and have long discussions with the warden and stuff, and no one is torturing them. So there is no question of the need for information. They're not interested in getting a public confession. That's not in the agenda. After 53, you do have torture, especially among Sazwan Afsaran, initially for information, in breaking the code, in identifying people. But once that is obtained, basically torture stops. The question is then the deal, if you sign something saying you regretted it, and so often it's meaningless. You would have Armenians signing a letter saying, yes, I joined the Tudeh, and then they discovered that the Tudeh was not a Muslim organization, so I want to resign from the organization. These were perfunctory statements that no one took seriously. But torture really then drops out until it comes out back as a form of getting public confessions towards the end of the Shah's period, and then, of course, gets fully blown onto the Islamic Republic. So there's no, I mean, my critique of Foucault is more that it's much more complicated. And historically, you have to look at it. And that's, I think, a better way of looking at it than larger on a jumbo level. And as Foucault says, he's not a historian, especially an Iranian historian.
Excellent point, especially about class distinction. The wealthy were given the posh treatment, even in prison, if they stole anything, but the poor. And it continues with some of the apologists of the Islamic Republic, especially the liberal type, who think crime is for the poor people. Crime is what poor people do. So if you don't feed the people, they will become criminals, which is a very bigoted reinterpretation of this whole ethos of human equality. Thank you very much. This was absolutely brilliant.
No, I mean, I'd go back to my original argument that history nowadays should be on questions, arguments, basically, or a counter argument. And then you have to have the evidence to prove your argument. And then the question you raise has to be significant. And that's where, of course, the trouble lies. What is significant for one person is not for another person. And often people argue, well, this historian is biased or has an agenda or has an axe to grind. I think that's the wrong question. Its question is what is the question the historian is raising? And you can then object to the question whether it is significant or not. But it's not a question that the historian sits down and says, I have an axe to grind, or that I'm going to only choose facts that fit into my argument, ignore negate argument facts that don't fit into my argument. I think that the biases don't come from that point of view. The biases come is for what initial question you raise. So that becomes the real, I think, difficulty in writing history is what are the questions we consider significant.
But Yerba and Hossein John, thank you so much. These have been really, really interesting and substantial discussions and, of course, presentations of your work, Yervand. But since this is our last meeting, I just hate to see us ending our conversation just speaking about tortured confessions and prisons and those kind of things. Yervand, you have spent your almost all adult life working on history, and particularly history of Iran, as a more positive, hopeful way of ending these discussions. How generally do you see the state of Iranian historiography? I'm not asking you to give us an analysis because we don't have time, but a couple of things that are going on that makes you either hopeful or you hope for.
Well, the hopeful thing is that there's so many more people studying history. When the Journal of Iranian Studies started, maybe there were about 20 academics in Iranian history, covering all Iranian history. Nowadays, there must be hundreds of people working on modern Iranian history, not just in Europe, America, Canada, and so on. So the numbers, the quantity has drastically increased. Sometimes, actually, I think the quality hasn't improved so much because so much of the history that is written is more descriptive rather than analytical. It tends to be what I called earlier antiquarianism, rather than asking significant questions about the past and trying to answer those questions and arguing with other significant questions and answers to the questions. So there's a quantitative expansion. The quality hasn't necessarily improved a lot. And within Iran, I think things are just as bad as they are under the Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, in that there is no political environment for people to be encouraged to write history, modern history. There's a lot of interest, but in the universities, basically, the academics don't have tenure security. So many things are considered politically too sensitive. So if you want a career, you try to avoid those issues. So it's left predominantly to the diaspora academics to work on modern Iran. So in that way, things within Iran, I don't think I'm not optimistic about writing. There's a lot of translation, a lot of interest in what goes on outside, but inside the country, I don't see much interesting work, research on contemporary history. And any good work that is done is often in the diaspora.